All of these criminalization approaches are rooted in the idea that people are choosing to be homeless, and if we make homelessness hard enough, they're just going to choose to not be homeless anymore, and nothing could be further from the truth.
They seem to have an idea that cruelty is somehow a solution to poverty. Yeah. It's the same old tired tactics of thinking that they can arrest themselves out of homelessness.
This is an inflection point for our country. We're asking the question, does the Constitution protect homeless people, or does it not?
The system is working exactly as designed to dehumanize a segment of our population. Look to see who is profiting off of poverty.
Oh, there are evil people in the world.
I clearly think as a James Bond villain.
Follow the money.
Underpaid, overworked homeless service professionals and advocates are literally beating back billionaires. We can turn the narrative, we can flip how this is shaking out, and win.
There are no excuses. We know how to end homelessness, and we have the resources right here and now.
It's just a matter of having the political will to invest in solutions. And to me, the irony of it all is
this video podcast, we sit down with experts and discuss how criminalization of homelessness is spreading and what you can do about it. We sit down with Jesse Rabinowitz, the campaign and communications director for the National Homelessness Law Center. David Peery is the executive director of the Miami Coalition Advance Racial Equity. He has lived experience of homelessness and he is a lawyer. Mari Castaldi is the director of state housing policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Tell us about this text you got.
About a sweep in Midtown Miami. It's in the oldest black neighborhood of Miami called Overtown, which is just right outside the central business district. It's where all the black homeless encampments used to be. The text was about an ongoing series of sweeps that have now left pretty much the entire streets where there is probably about 200 people sleeping entirely barren.
But those people weren't helped. They're just pushed to another area.
All their possessions apparently were trashed, taken away. The text said that they came in with these big garbage trucks that had the big mechanical claw that snatched up the tents and dumped them into a dump truck. And I'm also hearing from a lawyer who had just settled a lawsuit against the city just literally two or 3 weeks ago for their unlawful trashing of people's possessions without reasonable notice. They sold for $300,000 just really less than a month ago on behalf of 4 plaintiffs. And he said that in a call earlier today, and this is even before the latest sweep, he said on a call earlier today that it appears the city is violating the terms of the settlement agreement to give people at least 72 hours notice before they come through and sweep a certain area, and that they would also protect people's valued possessions and have a place where you could deposit it and come back and get it later on. But no, the city is simply going through and trashing everybody's stuff, scattering people around.
And here we are. I never thought we would be in a place 4 or 5 years ago. Momentum for housing was pushing forward, and now it's going backwards, and going backwards fast. I can't even imagine like what's happening in Kentucky, where the law is that somebody can use deadly force to remove a homeless person from their property.
And I think we have to be clear that this is not an accident. There is a well-funded, well-coordinated campaign not only to gut housing first, but to arrest and criminalize people experiencing homelessness. It does not happen in a vacuum, and we're getting out organized. We're getting our butts beaten. We can turn the narrative. We can flip how this is shaking out and win, because half of Americans are paying more than they can afford in rent. More and more Americans know that it's too expensive to live here, and that when rents are too high, people live outside. We can create a common narrative around that, but we have to do it. And there's no better time than now.
I really believe we're at a pinnacle moment. Could be 6 months, could be 2 years, but it's so urgent, we may never get a chance to recover.
Yeah, I think that another thing to note is, you mentioned Kentucky. We know that there are a wave of proposed pieces of legislation, particularly across deeply conservative states, but it's also the sweeps are happening. Criminalization is commonplace in places like we are right now in San Francisco, in like some of supposedly the most progressive cities and states in the country, but where we also know housing costs have spiraled so far beyond what people can control that homelessness is at a scale that's really never been seen before. And, you know, I worked at a legal aid in Oakland 10 years ago and was working with folks facing exactly what David just described. And so, you know, it's a question, I think, not only of like how to understand what is happening with some of these conservative forces, the well-funded forces, but also how they're really permeating more into sort of like the commonplace narrative, even in progressive places.
And you made a good point that, you know, it's not just a Republican thing. It's so easy for us to say, oh, it's a right-wing thing, but Democrats too, because they're pandering to voters.
In D.C., the National Park Service, who reports to the president, who is a Democrat, just announced that they're going to be clearing another encampment in May in order to beautify a park to get ready for the 250th birthday of America. What is more American than kicking homeless people out of a park?
So,
Happy birthday.
just to follow up on what you're saying, I see this as one of the few areas of bipartisan consensus.
Right.
Where it certainly appears that no matter if you're in a red state, blue state, whether you regard yourself as a conservative or a progressive or liberal, nonetheless, you seem to be resorting, or they seem to be resorting, to the same old tired tactics of thinking that they can arrest themselves out of homelessness, or they can somehow subject the homeless to such cruel circumstances as to somehow force them into quote-unquote accepting services that they'll say in the same breath aren't available, by the way, okay, in order to get off the streets. And so to me, that's the weirdest thing of them all. It's bad enough that you agree on criminalization, but when you realize that criminalization has been tried for, 40 years now? And all we're doing is digging ourselves deeper and deeper and deeper into a hole, you know, and if the first rule of holes is to stop digging, it certainly appears to me that the localities are doing the exact opposite. They're not asking for a ladder out of the hole. They're simply asking for a bigger shovel to continue digging.
Yeah.
And so I don't understand that, you know, why? You know, is it that we have a cultural bigotry against the poor that's shared by both conservatives and progressives?
The public, we got out of COVID. Well, there's a lot of reasons, but, you know, fear, hatred. Politicians are pandering to voters. They've been able to weaponize criminalization rhetoric. We've seen it locally in Los Angeles, and I'm sure it's going to happen really big here in 2024. And the election season is just starting, and there's billions of dollars that go into campaign ads that saturate every media channel that are going to be spreading misinformation and intentional disinformation, pushing for criminalization, not for any other reason than they want your vote.
Exactly.
All of these criminalization approaches, whether it's Kentucky, San Francisco, Johnson v. Grants Pass, are rooted in the idea that people are choosing to be homeless. And if we make homelessness hard enough, as if it isn't already incredibly hard, they're just going to choose to not be homeless anymore, and nothing could be further from the truth.
I would substitute the word painful and more
Fair.
suffering.
Yep.
Not just
I
hard,
don't mean to laugh,
but more cruel. They seem to have an idea that cruelty is somehow a solution to poverty.
Yeah.
I've talked to state legislators and advocating around homelessness who have literally said, I have constituents calling my office saying there's an encampment on my corner and they want it gone and I want to be responsive. And the only tool that I have is to try to push people away. It's not necessarily, I don't have a housing unit to offer. I can call the service provider. They'll tell me there's no shelter bed open or that there's no rental voucher unless someone is on a wait list for a decade, right? And so I think that it's becoming like increasingly at the surface, right? That some of this is at work.
You know, before 2020, I would have believed that. But I was astonished by March of 2021 when they somehow found money and they found resources to completely protect and get off the streets every single vulnerable person in Miami.
That's such a great
Okay,
point.
they started off with the 65 plus seniors who are homeless.
Yeah.
They went into the disabled ones, the ones that had the physical disabilities and the wheelchairs. Then they went into the ones with chronic diseases. But basically, they found a way to put into hotels, motels, and other shelters every single person on the street. There are no excuses. We know how to end homelessness, and we have the resources right here and now.
I think there's truth to what you're both saying, right? Which is, I'm walking down the street, I see an encampment, I don't want to see it anymore. I call my local elected official. Their tool belt is pretty limited. The funding that we need, that the federal government has shown that whether it's money for war or money for putting people in hotels, they have access to, exists. But when you see an encampment, you're not calling your senator, you're not calling the White House. And I think that's where the discrepancy is. What if your senator's phone rang every time you saw an encampment? There would be a different sense of urgency.
And David, I don't know Florida, but I know California. And the reason they call it Project Roomkey here, the reason that they started putting homeless people in hotels wasn't to help homeless people. They were worried homeless people would take up ICU beds for the housed people. So if the housed people got COVID and all these homeless people took up the ICU beds, oh my gosh, what are us housed people going to do?
Right.
But we also saw emergency housing vouchers. We
Oh,
saw
yeah.
emergency rental assistance, right? Some of the housing resources at scale, recognizing people can't afford housing. People are going to lose their housing in
Good
this
point.
crisis, right? So I think it's like a really good point that the resources are there. And I even think at a state level in California, so we saw through COVID federal funding that went to the states, kind of an unprecedented but one-time infusion of resources through COVID. And communities have been able to make a lot happen with that. And it's already, we're facing these huge cliffs as numbers go up. And the question of, are we willing to really look at new revenue sources? Are we willing to look at things like corporate tax rates and taxing wealth? So even though those tools are limited, they're really big questions. Like those, I think what you're saying really resonates around, like, the resources are out there. It's just a matter of having the political will to invest in solutions. And to me, the irony of it all is,
I just love the Invisible People newsletter. Whenever I see it pop up on my inbox, it's the very first thing that I click on because it always contains such interesting and valuable information. It is such a valuable, invaluable resource that I look to every week.
it's just a matter of having the political will to invest in solutions. And to me, the irony of it all is that's the only thing that's going to get encampments off the street.
That's the only thing missing. I certainly greatly respect what you guys say. The lesson that I learned from 2021 was, regardless of what the motivation is, when the powers that be, the state, local, and federal governments, see that there is an emergency, regardless of what their motivation is to protect the well-paying white people living up in $1 million towers, it's not a matter of compassion for the poor, but regardless of what the motivation is, when they see there's an emergency, they can find the money.
Oh, yeah.
The money suddenly appears.
Right. If
Okay,
there was an
and
earthquake
then the
here,
money
heaven
is-
forbid, they would find housing for everybody
Yes.
displaced.
Exactly. And they found housing for each and every person on the streets. So to me, there are no excuses. We can end homelessness
know how to do
this
it.
year.
So
Okay, if the political will was, that's the only thing missing. We know how to do it. We have the resources. The only thing missing is a political will.
and public and political will. We kind of went out the gate and we're running, but you mentioned Grants Pass. So you want to bring us into that conversation?
To get involved, people should visit www.johnsonvgrantspass.com. There are about 40,000 people who live there. In Grants Pass, like in America, half of the rental households can't afford to pay rent. There are no shelters. There is a gospel rescue mission where, in order to stay there, you have to work 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, go to church twice a day, and pay $100 a month for the pleasure of living there. If you're too old or sick or elderly to work, you can't stay there at all. We know that when rents are high and there are no shelters, people live outside or in their cars. Grants Pass decided to respond to homelessness, not with things that work like services or housing, but by giving people $350 tickets for using things like a blanket or a pillow. Their camping ban literally calls out blankets and pillows. That's how cut and dry this is. The Oregon Legal Center and people experiencing homelessness didn't think that was fair. They sued the city, and the court said, you're right. If the city's not going to provide you a safe place to stay, it's cruel and unusual punishment for them to give you a ticket for doing what you have to sleep outside. Unfortunately, a whole group of cities and states and corporations and business interests came together and said the Supreme Court needs to reverse this. A lot of the logic and the rhetoric they were using said that the reason why we have homelessness in California is because we can't arrest people.
That's so insane to me.
Really?
Me too.
Yes, but that's what they said. And the Supreme Court
It is insanity.
was moved enough by that argument to say, yeah, we're going to hear the case. And this is an inflection point for our country. This is really a time where we're asking the question, does the Constitution protect homeless people or does it not? And we can either go in one of two directions. We can say people experiencing homelessness are protected by our laws or they are not. We think we can win the case, but I want to be very clear that even if we win the case, the Supreme Court will produce exactly 0 units of housing and exactly 0 units of shelter. So this has to be a galvanizing moment, an inflection point for the entire country, for us to move away from this harmful, untrue narrative that we can punish our way out of homelessness and fund the housing that we need. David, talk about Miami. I think it's so important.
I want to return back to this motivation question because I think it's so important. The second lesson that I believe I learned in 2021. First of all, that the resources are there and they know what to do, okay, to solve homelessness. And then it begs the question, why aren't they doing it? Okay? Is it intentional? Is it accidental? Or people just throwing up their hands? And I'm coming to the conclusion that it's very intentional, that the system is working exactly as designed, that is a concerted effort to dehumanize a segment of our population, okay, to relegate them into areas outside of the urban areas. Okay, and this is reflected within the Cicero Institute legislation. Provide tent cities for the poor and reserve the cities, the inner cities, for the people who can afford the escalating outrageous rents. And in order to do that, you have to dehumanize a certain segment of the people who are poor, the people who are people of color, black people, and brown people. This is a way that you maintain the system, you prop it up, you keep real estate prices high. Because if you have housing first and you have housing as a human right, that's going to affect the bottom line of these capitalist real estate developers. So it seems to me that if you really want to discern the basis of any American policy, you use those 3 words that came from Watergate. Follow the money. Look to see who is profiting off of poverty, who is profiting off this misery, who is profiting off this pain and suffering. And you'll see that the folks at the top of this Cicero Institute are the people that run these venture capitalist, private equity organizations, that basically make a hell of a lot of money off of the high-end real estate market. And Housing First is a direct attack on their abilities to make profits.
I was a person that didn't believe in all this. I mean, because it sounds like James Bond villain shit, right? You're right? And then all of a sudden, Cicero Institute pops up, and Joe Lonsdale, and it's like, oh, there are evil people in the world,
Yeah,
he's stroking that little kitty, and he's looking out of his window. And
I mean, I clearly think Joe Lonsdale is a James Bond villain, and I don't disagree, but I'm conflicted because in D.C., the way we got the voucher program to work was to pay exorbitant voucher prices. So landlords were actually profiting from housing people experiencing homelessness, which I know isn't the case everywhere, but they're actually making more money by housing someone with a voucher than they would someone else, which totally destroys the rental market, and there are all of these other implications. But I agree, and I think it's a bit more complicated, but no disagreement. Joe Lonsdale is a bad dude.
DC may be different because we have so many examples in Miami of people with housing vouchers who find it impossible to find housing.
No, absolutely.
That's
absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
Well, when you think about what the end game is of some of these criminalization policies, it does make you really question the motivation, because just the logical conclusion of you have someone who is in a very precarious situation, they have few belongings, their belongings get taken. That could be their ID. That could be their medication, right? Like what could help them get into housing. They're maybe put out of contact with a service provider that has been supporting them try to get into housing. So now it's even harder for them to get into housing. They get a $350 ticket, which they can't pay. They have to go to court. If they don't pay it, a warrant could be issued for their arrest, right? Like all of these things are just barriers that get between someone actually having the outcome that we say would end homelessness, right? Getting them housed. And so it does you start to question, like, what's the plan here? And I can see how you can kind of conclude that, like, oh, this is the plan. Like, there isn't really a clearer plan to actually get people housed.
Dehumanization and class warfare. Move the poor out of the cities, reserve the cities for the people who can afford these outrageous escalating rents. That appears to me to be the plan. Maintain the commodification of housing and fight against housing as a human right.
Well, here in California, it's $132,000 per inmate per year. So the thinking that we're going to arrest our way out of homelessness is literally insane.
So why do they all do it?
I
They're not insane. They're very sane.
Well, that is where I have problems, David, because you look at, these high net worth individuals and you're like, they're smart people.
Exactly.
But even on their own, they're pushing conspiracy theories. And it's like, how can somebody that smart believe that or even share that?
I feel like everything we're saying is so common sense. And so many people, most people are experiencing strains in their budgets because they can't afford housing. And so, but also people don't, I think, see themselves as closer to homelessness than they are to Joe Lonsdale. So like, that's my question is, how do we really get people to kind of invest in the common sense solutions of getting people housed and also kind of make the solutions really work for everyone too, right? Because many of us are struggling, right? This is a conference full of people working to end homelessness. In Los Angeles, there was a report that said most people working to end homelessness have experienced homelessness themselves, and they're not getting paid enough to afford housing in Los Angeles, right? So it's a problem that's really touching so many of us. And I've been really curious in trying to sit with how do we kind of make the logic of what we're talking about really catch hold with how many people are impacted by this crisis.
And I think one small thing we can do is recognize that those of us who think about homelessness all day draw some lines that not everyone else draws. And it's been really illustrative to learn that of course, when we know that when rents are high, people experience homelessness. But most, the average American doesn't make that connection intuitively. And we have to really just draw it out and hold their hand and be like, yeah, do you know why there's so many people experiencing homelessness in San Francisco? It's not because they don't have laws that they can criminalize them. It's because rent is too high. And did you know that when rent is high, more people experience homelessness? And if we can just draw those connections for people, we can start to reframe the narrative away from homelessness being a personal choice and towards homelessness being a policy choice.
So this whole personal choice versus policy choice thing is very interesting, or at least a systemic consequence rather than a personal choice. Is very interesting. And I think that's that myth that people choose to be homeless, okay, a reckless and dangerous myth that I think is promulgated. Again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, okay? All I'm saying is those three words: follow the money. Yeah. See who is profiting off of poverty. See who is profiting off of homelessness. Okay, it's not conspiracy. Maintaining this myth that people choose to be homeless is part of the ways to prop up the system. If we stop believing that if we stop overemphasizing the personal responsibility portion of being homeless and underemphasizing, if totally ignoring the systemic issues that manufacture poverty, because poverty is a manufactured. There needs to be no poverty in America, period.
I always say the only choice in homelessness is if you're going to take action to fix the affordable housing crisis.
Exactly. If we ignore the systemic issues that manufacture poverty and breed homelessness, then we can maintain that status quo.
Yeah.
Okay,
You-
so that's what I'm saying. It's intentional.
Well, you'll notice that the people that are often screaming about the homeless industrial complex, and there is a homeless industrial complex, and we need to get better. There's waste, there's bureaucracy, but nobody that I've met is going, let's grow homelessness, right? But if you look at the other side, the criminalization industrial complex, they are going, and they're the ones pushing for that. And the truth is, homeless sector is better than it ever has of housing people, but they can't keep up. I mean, here in the Bay Area, for every person they get out of homelessness, 3 new people enter into. That's why more money is being spent. That it's not that the homeless sector is failing and wants to grow the homeless industrial complex. It's because we haven't fixed the systemic causes of homelessness.
And it gets me so riled up that these people saying, all of you homeless advocates who are getting rich, we're not. The people pushing that are literal billionaires. They are literal billionaires. What would it look like if we taxed them out of existence to fund the housing that would end homelessness?
This idea that people choose to be homeless is a bald-faced lie. I have been homeless myself. I lived for 2.5 years on the streets of Miami. I am not an advocate for the homeless. I've literally interacted with thousands of people who have experienced homelessness. I have not met one person who would freely leave the safety of 4 walls and a locked door to live unsheltered and vulnerable on the streets. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So we need to, first of all, understand that homelessness, urban homelessness, I'm sure that some people maybe in the wilds of Montana or Idaho or someplace like that might want to live off the grid. But no one chooses homelessness. Okay, we need a full stop on that. The second issue we need to understand is this one about sanctioned encampments. And I've changed radically my view on sanctioned encampments. I thought perhaps, well, maybe ones are not run by the government, that maybe naturally arise. Maybe those aren't too bad. And they're a safe place for people to reside. No. Everyone deserves safe and habitable housing. And we should not relegate the poor to be living in tin cans or tents or anything like that. Tiny homes are fine as long as they have plumbing, electricity, air conditioning, heating, and a toilet. Okay? As long as they have those things, fine.
Jail cells have toilets. Pallet shelters do not.
But as long as they're habitable, okay? The poor deserve the dignity and respect of a habitable place just like anybody else does. And we should not relegate the poor to live in tent cities. And if we encourage sanctioned encampments, cities are going to race to the bottom.
Well, that's the problem, is that it's all moving towards forced internment camps.
Exactly. And that's what they've become. In 1930s Germany showed us what happens. When you dehumanize a segment of people, when you move them into internment camps, then you see that slippery slope of what happens.
The other thing I would say in terms of what people can do is there's grants passed. That's happening in the Supreme Court. But there are pieces of legislation in dozens of states across the country as we speak, including California, to essentially pass new criminalization laws all across the country. And we talked a little bit about politicians responding to pressure and how they're responding to the pressure that they're getting from folks who are saying, we want to see this encampment gone. Well, we also need to be responding with that pressure of like, we want investment in the real solutions. We don't want you to pass more failed policies that are just going to perpetuate homelessness in our community and harm people further. And so I think, Housing Not Handcuffs is another website that the National Homelessness Law Center runs, which shows where there are active pieces of legislation across the country.
There's a threat tracker.
Exactly. And so, being clear on whether there's something in your home state that maybe your legislators could be voting on in the next week or in the coming months, and actually being able to kind of stop some of these threats as they arise, I think is also a big part of the kind of groundswell that we need to be working towards.
And I think it's really important to be rooted in hope and possibility. And I think it's important to name that, we have beat back the Cicero Institute in states like Hawaii, Iowa, Kansas, Indiana. Our scrappy group of underpaid, overworked homeless service professionals and advocates are literally beating back billionaires. And we can do that more, and we can do that better when we all come together with an understanding that criminalization not only does nothing to end homelessness, it makes homelessness worse.
A lot of this is driven by the public complaining to politicians. That is an issue that we need to solve. And for me, how you stop that is by removing encampments with housing, because encampments with criminalization will just grow. But how do you have any sense of how many people are calling, and how do we get businesses and the public to say, okay, well, this criminalization is just pushing people around. We need to really solve homelessness.
Yeah, the very few people making calls to local elected officials can have a huge impact. I think our side has forgotten how powerful we can be. We're really good at mobilizing people around a specific thing, but like the opposition is calling their council member every day to be like, hey, I don't want to see this encampment here, and I'm not going to vote for you if it's there. I'll never forget, I was trying to win a legislative battle in DC, and I asked the chief of staff to a council member how they were going to vote. And she called me into her office and pulled up their neighborhood next door page and was literally tallying comments for, comments against. And there were like 4, like very few comments on either side. But that was a huge factor in how they made their decision. Wow. So we give up things like we don't want to get in arguments on Nextdoor or Facebook. And
America by Nextdoor.
Exactly, but it's terrifying.
It's scary.
And how many of us have canceled our Nextdoor accounts because it's a racist shithole? But that's what elected officials are using to inform the decision making.
I agree that I don't think it takes that many calls to really make an impact, especially on local and state officials.
I'm glad you brought it up.
A place where a lot of folks show up is not just calling their electeds to say, hey, I see this encampment, but also when there's a proposal for a new supportive housing development in their neighborhood and they come to the zoning committee meeting and complain, they don't have that empathy, they don't have that understanding. And I've seen in real time how it takes like just having a handful of people there in person voicing strong support, talking about the evidence and how this could work to give those politicians enough cover to do the right thing and make the right decisions. So I think it's one of those things, it's not the sexiest form of advocacy to think about like your local zoning committee meetings, but I do think that, we can think about what we can do as advocates, as a sector, to make those kinds of actions feel accessible, to really have us all feel empowered to take that kind of stand and be that kind of neighbor.
Okay, and this goes back to the empathy problem, the compassion problem that I was stating earlier. You see somebody out there on the street suffering, okay? You see somebody on the street filthy, bleeding, okay, in horrible circumstances. I guess there's 2 perceptions that you can get from that. Either A, that's their own damn fault, okay? This mentally ill, drug-abused person made the wrong choices, and so they're sitting here filthy and stinking and bleeding in front of the home that I spent my discipline and sweat and business, to build up, and they're taken away from that, and let's get rid of this crummy person, okay? So you A, dehumanize them, and then you B, look at some way to punish them, to force them into making some better choices. Or you can have a perception that, hey, this person may be a victim of some intergenerational poverty that he had no choice in terms of his economic circumstances, okay? And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't afford a 1-bedroom apartment off a $7.25 minimum wage, and he also has chronic disease, diabetes, that prevents him from working, that he can't even get health care for because you can't afford a predatory for a healthcare system. Okay, so now you're taking it away from that personal responsibility, and you're looking now at systemic issues that force that person to sleep in front of your business. Okay, so maybe we can take a different perception here and say, well, instead of punishing that person, we're seeing here that maybe that's not that person's fault. Maybe we need to do things to change our system here, our institutions, in order to protect that person, also strengthen our community. Because by lifting that person up, we can also lift up our community and get that person back into being a productive member of our community. To answer this question about this complaint, it goes deeper into our perception of whether these are unhoused neighbors or members of our community that need a hand up versus irresponsible people that just want free stuff that have made bad choices and they need to be punished even more.
If you had 3 wishes, what would they be?
About homelessness or life?
Whatever. The genie's just rubbing the lamp.
A larger measure of empathy for folks and stop this divisiveness, of us versus them, to think that people simply by virtue of poverty are somehow different or lesser or lower. This Horatio Alger, what do you call it, lifts them up by the bootstraps nonsense, maybe that's a second wish, would just go away, because research has shown that the economic quintile that your parents in are overwhelmingly going to be the economic quintile that you are going to be in. If you really want to be a millionaire, you have to choose your parents wisely. So I would wish for empathy, and I'd wish for people to be disabused of this notion. Of course, some people move up, some people move down, but overwhelmingly, there's some very powerful forces that keep you in the same economic circumstances as your parents.
Yeah, mine was something like housing, food, and care for everyone who needs it. But I think actually, like, your wish would have to come true first for that to be possible, right? Because that is the logical conclusion of believing that everyone deserves what they need to thrive, is when you have that empathy, it makes perfect sense that that's like what we need to be delivering.
And I think it goes back to what David was talking about during COVID, which my wish is like we actually remember that all of our well-being is interconnected. And when we do that, the government can put cash in our bank accounts. The government can build housing and fund hotels. We can actually be decent to each other. But we've moved so far from that, even in the past 2 years. It's heartbreaking.
Well, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thanks for having us.
We're going to be decent to you.